Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome our second keynote of the Varsity Sci Symposium, Professor Prof Perrins, who is a professor of ornithology at Oxford and is also Emeritus Fellow at the Edward Gray Institute of Field Ornithology. A distinguished ornithologist, Professor Perrins has worked on a number of fruitful long-term population ecology studies, starting from the famous Wytham Woods habitat. This work led to many valuable insights into bird breeding behaviours and survivability. Remarkably, Professor Perrins is also the first Warden of the Swans, appointed by the owner of all unmarked Mute Swans in the United Kingdom, the royal household. Thanks to his research, swan numbers recovered after the banning of lead angling weights. He has also served as president of the International Ornithological Congress and its European equivalent. Therefore, we are very grateful to Professor Perrins for accepting our invitation, and we look forward to his keynote speech. And I'll just hand over to Professor Perrins.
Okay, thank you very much. This is my first attempt at one of these too, so you may have to forgive me when I get a bit lost. You're looking at the subject of this talk. Obviously, it's a bird that you might think is very well known because everybody knows it, but remarkably, it sort of slipped the net from serious studies until relatively recently, because everybody thought, well, it's not a wild bird, but in fact it's been here. If you go back, it came with when the ice ages receded and the country got bit easier to live in, and it's been here ever since, despite various occasions where people have said it's been introduced. Over in the Cambridge Way, there's quite a lot of subfossil mute swans in the peat records of East Anglia, so I think there's no question that it's been here since we got recolonized by animals after the Ice Age. So, like most of the animals that came in at that time, they found it an area fairly empty of people, and so they flourished there for quite a while. We're talking about 10,000 years ago and onwards, and I suppose we had what would have been similar habitats. If man had not intervened, the habitats would be roughly similar to the ones they were here about 6,000 years ago, and then progressively after that, people got more common. And the population of humans increased, and of course humans eat meat, so there were a lot of hungry people around, and over the years, as the numbers of people increased and their hunting skills increased too, we managed to hunt out most of the larger animals in the UK. If you think of the mammals, the wolf, bear, beavers, hyena, lynx, boar, they all went quite some time ago, but the large birds did too. The cranes, the pelicans, the storks and bustards were all eliminated by either change of habitat or overhunting, usually really both. And the odd one out is this guy. And the question is, why did he survive here when all these other large animals disappeared? It's even more curious when you think a little bit about its lifestyle. All birds molt. They have to replace their feathers every year as they wear out, and that's particularly important for flying birds with the major flight feathers. These birds, if you're a small bird like a tit or even as big as a pigeon, you can reasonably fly okay when you're shedding. If you shed one or two of those big feathers at a time, but keep most of the wing intact, you can fly reasonably okay. But when you get as big as a swan, a gap in the wing is quite serious for the chances of being able to take off. So what swans and most of the ducks and geese have done is they have a period in the year when they drop all the feathers, all the flight feathers together, and are flightless. This is the difference between the two sexes. This is the male tends to have a bigger knob on the beak than the female. There's an overlap. On the whole, it works, but not perfect. So once they've shed their feathers, you have the rather ignominious look of an adult mute swan, totally unable to fly, and you can see the new feathers growing there. Then if you look a little bit more closely, you can see two lots of the inner wing and the outer wing, the flight feathers just starting to grow through. And closer up, you can see also that they've got a lot of blood in their quill. These feathers are growing very, very quickly, enormous amount of energy being put into them, but also that blood is hot. If you put your hand on a wing feather of a bird like that, you can feel the heat in those feathers. And you can see a little bit about that with this, which is an infrared photograph of an outstretched wing. And the more intense the light, the more heat is being given out. And so you can see at the bottom, there are protrusions of the bit you were looking at in the previous picture with the red going down into the quills of the new growing feathers, is putting out a lot of heat and is losing a lot of weight. As a minor bit of biology, the birds run their lifestyles at a much higher temperature than we do. And if you look at the top center, you can actually see the hand of somebody holding the wing out for the photograph, and you can see they're not putting out anything like as much heat as the birds do. That's a bit by the way. So these birds have a flightless period in the year, and that meant that people hunted them with great enthusiasm at that time. It was a very good way of collecting food, and they did it over most of Europe. This is actually obviously a drawing from the middle of about 1850 in Sweden, where they were having a big roundup prior to a feast. Bit of a license, or artist license, of course, but they round them up in the bay like that when the birds are in molt, and they have a feast. So not only were people eating all these big birds and big mammals, but they were eating swans, and swans were easy to catch. So why are they still here? And it's a puzzle really, but it's pretty clear, I think, why swans are still here. But the explanation is in two parts, and both arguments are weak, and the timing of them is simply unknown. The first is that we know quite a lot of the details of records of swans due to a man called Ticehurst, who wrote this book 70 years ago or so now, where he reviewed a lot of the ancient history of swans in the country, but he still didn't answer the two questions that I'm sort of trying to address. The first reason why they stayed was that the people around there discovered that they could effectively farm them. If you kept them and rounded them up each summer when they were flightless, you could get the cygnets, the babies, and fatten some of those up for Christmas. So they became a farmed animal. But there's a problem with that, and that is that you have to have the farmers agreeing with each other that there's going to have some sort of system. So in fact, they became owned by somebody or other, and in order to own them, then of course they had to mark them so they knew whose were which. And in order to mark them, they had to be caught. Well, we know how they can catch them. Every year you can go out and round them all up again. So they became a farm animal. But who decided who owned them? And this is the biggest curiosity, because it's simply way before any written records of these things. At some point in time, the king ordained that all the swans in the country belonged to him. As I say, we don't know when, and we don't know how he got away with it. But he then, of course, he couldn't the first written record of anything of this sort is around 1186. Actually, the guy about which it was said that the birds were royal birds was the Bishop of Lincoln, and the Bishop of Lincoln, his bishopric extended just to and beyond Oxford. For those of the local, the Godstone Nunnery was just inside his territorial boundary, so he ran Oxford as well. The king then obviously couldn't rush around the country coping with all of them, so there was a widespread network of swans and swan markers who kept an eye on the birds, and then the king gave swans or the rights to put a mark on birds with their own mark to bishops and dukes and earls and important people around the country. So all these people could have a right to own the swans, and they were the ones who effectively policed it because it was to their benefit. And the little people catching a swan or killing a swan, there were very severe penalties if you did that. So the whole thing was run by a series of local swan masters. The only exception to that was that obviously each pair nests, and they very often nested, I'm sorry, I'm out of focus. In order to mark them, they used to make cuts on the beak with knives, which each one was separate from the others. And so when you caught the bird, you can look at its beak and you could tell from the mark who owned it. This is an early-ish roll called the Cantley roll, which dates from about 1500 or so. Nothing like as old as the first records that the birds were royal. These things were, so it is said, and it appears to be, all the local marks were put up in one of these things called a swan roll, and they were taken out by the swan master when the birds were being caught, and you could only catch and mark them when he was present, and he would undo this roll and to check if he didn't know who the bird belonged to. So a rather complicated thing. I'm not surprised that not very many of these rolls exist because they presumably fell apart in the water. The one exception to getting any reward at all for the normal people was that each bird nested on somebody's ground, and the person who guarded the nest, if the nest was successful, had the right to one of the signets, or he was the nester, so called. But it got more complicated than that because he was an ordinary person. He wasn't allowed to own a swan, so he was given one of the signets, but had immediately to sell it to one of the owners of the parents. So he got quite a lot of money for it, but he couldn't actually own it properly. The one other thing I haven't mentioned that they did at this time, of course, if you want to be able to find your swans, you don't want them to fly away. So what they did was they pinioned them, which is taking off the outer digit, the outer section of one of the wings, so the birds were flightless. That's not a very nice thing to do without anaesthetic. It's not very nice anyway. But it was widely done, and it was done both to the parents and to the signets, so that everybody's ownership every owner could have a reasonable chance of finding the birds that belong to them. There's another oddity about this in that Ticehurst records a lot of incidents of, in fact, the book is largely full of examples of marks and how you identified them and who inherited ones from another. but there's remarkably little information about the numbers of birds they were doing all the time, which I think you might have expected. The reason for that seems to be okay, and it's an interesting example of our behaviour, I suppose. Each time they've caught a brood and marked them, for the honour of being allowed to mark them, the owner of the mark had to pay the king a fairly substantial amount of money. And there are a few cases where the owners were caught out because they fiddled the books not very convincingly, and so they were obviously cheating on how many birds they marked. But I guess this is probably by no means the first example of tax avoidance, but it's a pretty widespread one, I think, and that's probably why we have very few records of how many birds there were there. So this network existed for many years, with all the birds being caught, rounded up, pinioned, and released again. And then when the owner caught the cygnets, he had a decision to make. He could put them back in to fatten up, so he could put them back in to increase the stock, or he could put them in a fattening moat and fatten them up for Christmas. So each one had to make a decision on how many they wanted to do one or the other. And so we had a flightless, these birds were flightless at least since the 1100s, and probably a bit before. They were effectively flightless. The swan population in England was largely flightless, maybe for 1,000 years. As I say, we have no firm date at all of the beginning of this. So what changed? Well, what changed really was there were two things, I suppose, but related. One was that they got better farmyard animals, better stocks of geese, particularly, but other poultry and other animals. So the need for the meat was less, but also the people, the locals on the estates who had to go out and get wet during July and August when they wanted to be getting their crops in, was not a very popular pastime. So gradually, this countrywide thing just fell out of use. This started to be evident around 1800, and probably by about 1850, there were very few owners claiming ownership of the birds and putting a mark on them. Three bodies currently still maintain rights to ownership, and two you will have seen, I'm sure, because they're often on the television at various stages of the roundups in the spring. The vintners and the dyers companies who own swans and share the birds on the Thames with the Crown. And this is them in their rather tidier gear. Which way around are the vintners here, the dyers here, and the Crown ones in red. It does require rather a large team of people to do the roundup, which is another reason why it wasn't too popular. And they are still doing it. They still do it on the Thames now. Well, unfortunately, COVID stopped it in 2020. But they use the same rowboats that they used to use. Some of those are fairly ancient, and they have 6 boats, 2 for vintners, 2 dyers, 2 Crown. And they effectively make a ring round the broods, haul them up to the edge, close them in, and then pick them out. This is done purely for traditional purposes now. Nobody takes them or eats them. They're just ringed, and the vintners and dyers, instead of putting their own marks on them, put their own rings on them now and put them back in the river. And then we get to have a look at them, we check them. This is the sort of age they would have been deciding to take them off and fatten them up if they were going to. But we get to have a look at them all and we weigh them. This is my invention. I'm particularly proud of it. It's a Swan weighing bag with some very useful pieces of wire for doing it. And we don't, of course, know how old the birds are when we catch them, so the weight on its own is not much use. But there's a fairly steady and reasonably predictable growth rate of the beak, so of the head. So if we measure the heads, then we can get a reasonable measure of age, and so we can plot their weights and measures against them. And this is the distribution of the weights in a single year, and so we can look at the growth rates and see if they're doing as well as other years or various other things about them. So there's a little bit of not very high level science in it, but recording and monitoring how they're doing. We also get a lot of people watching, lots of school parties come, and we talk them about the maintenance of the river, particularly about hazards to animals like trailing fishing lines and one thing and another. So we get quite a good turnout of children to talk to as well. The other place where there's still ownership of swans is very different. For those of you who know the area, this is South Dorset. This is an area of water called the Fleet, behind the Chesil Bank, which runs westwards from Weymouth. It's a very odd piece of geology. It's a very stable shingle bank, occasionally breached by water in the winter, but there's a series of streams flow into it, and there's the outflow is at this end, and there's a colony of swans. Most swans nest territorially, and rather unfriendly to neighbours. Here, for some reason, you can see the edge of the bay. You can see a smattering of swans out here. About 100 pairs. Now, normally, in most recent years, 100 to 150 pairs of swans nest there in one single place. And so these have been owned by the Ilchester family for something like 600 years, and they maintain this thing. It's much visited, you'll see in a minute. But we've been given a permission to look at the birds there and see how they compare with the ones on the Thames. You can see here there's 3, 4, 5, 6 pairs nesting along here in very close proximity, which you would never see anywhere else. We don't know why that is. And then you get crowds of people coming down to watch them being fed. And one thing which is slightly sort of, you might think, reminiscent of olden times, we catch them when they're in the molt. I say we, as you can see, there's a fair number of assistants there. We drive them ashore and check them over for rings, see who's still alive, weigh them, measure them, and pop them all back in again. Nobody eats them nowadays. And the one other interesting thing here historically is that the owners of the swans there have never pinioned them. So this is the one part of the UK of England where you could go and expect to see flying swans in those days. You certainly couldn't have done them since. So that's a little potted history of what some of the things about swans. What are they? Where are they today? Well, the swans, as I said, were owned by the Crown, and they're still owned by the Crown. Legally, if you tamper with one, you could be booked under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, just as well if you tampered with a blackbird or something. They're viewed as wild birds, but the Crown can, if it wishes, own them and claim them, and it can occasionally and has occasionally taken people to court for more serious misdemeanors with them. The rule is slightly quirky and is often misunderstood. The Crown has prerogative right to own a swan, which means it can own the swan if it wants to. It doesn't usually go around claiming, say, I want that one or that one. But it does mean that you can't claim it, you can't take it and put it on your pond without permission, because the Crown could claim it. It's the prerogative right that prevents anyone else doing anything with them. And so legally, almost anything you wanted to do with a swan would actually be illegal. Slightly quirky way of doing it, but that's the way it goes. I said that there were very few records of numbers. The only numbers that I know of that are reasonably okay are the vintners and dyers, who've been doing it on the river since at least 1400. And we've got records from about 1720 or so of the numbers of birds on the River Thames from London to Henley, which is what is shown here. And so they seem to be consistent over periods of time with ups and downs. I've no idea at all why those two big peaks in the 1700s and 1800s occurred. There's no written record that I know of that gives any clue to that. We know a bit more sort of from about 1900 onwards about what was happening. Around that time, people were starting, the trains were available, so you could get out of London, and there's a sort of commuter belt developing. So people had at least weekend cottages along the Thames, and people were generally getting more interested in the wildlife and the Thames. And so there was more care for them. But at the same time, London was growing rapidly, and in order to have the building materials, a lot of the early gravel pits were dug at that time. And those, of course, are fairly good nesting grounds for many waterfowl, including swans. So we got increases in numbers of swans in the general area of the Thames and coming onto the Thames. Now, remember already that these birds, because they weren't owned by anybody, were free flying, so they were flying onto the Thames, whereas the Thames population at that time, all these counts of the vintners and dyers ones, they were pinioning them. So they could tell immediately when they caught a brood as to whether the parents were flyers or Thames birds. And so they associated this increase very clearly with an increase in birds moving in onto the river from elsewhere. These numbers started to increase quite seriously in the 1920s or so, and some of the locals were complaining that there were too many of them. And they had for 20 years, they visited the swans' nests all the way up and down the area they were working, and removed all the eggs except for 2, so that each pair only raised at the most 2 chicks. And that obviously, in theory, reduced the numbers severely, but didn't have a great deal of effect, because again, you had this number of birds flying in from outside. So the numbers were increasing again quite steadily. They took a dip towards the end of the Thames, towards the end of the war, because quite a lot of the Thames became uninhabitable. There was a lot of oil on it, and so lots of birds were oiled. I suspect that a few birds were eaten because people were pretty hungry then, and so the numbers dropped. But then when the war ended, or shortly after the war ended, people started to inhabit the area and look after the birds a bit, and you saw a meteoric rise to far higher numbers than there had ever been before in recorded time anyway. And that went on until up into the 1950s, when suddenly they went into a very steep decline. And It's not completely clear why it was so sharp and why it happened so suddenly, but it seems to have happened with changes in angling behaviour. More anglers were out fishing out fishing. They were using new nylon lines, and they were discarding a lot of this because it was easy and cheap. And so there was lots of lead available. And a very large number of these birds were dying of lead poisoning. I don't want to go too long into it, but the birds take up the lead, sometimes just because it's on the weight, sometimes when they're looking for little bits of gravel because they need grit to help them digest their food. They then grind the lead down and the poison is taken into the body, and the muscles of the gizzard and the lower neck stop working. And you can see slightly on the left, but markedly on the right, a bird that is suffering from acute lead poisoning. The muscles have stopped working, it's carried on feeding, and it's stuffed its gizzard with food, which can't go, is not pumped on any further by the muscles, and so it effectively is dying of starvation with a gizzard full of food. And very large numbers of birds were affected by this. These are various pieces of lead fishing weights. Every single piece there was taken out of a dead swan when it was post-mortem, and we had measures of the blood lead levels and things too. They were clearly large numbers of them were dying. So a big row went on about this, and eventually in 1987 lead angling weights were banned for the largest range of normal weights. A few little ones and a few big ones are still allowed. And this is the number of pairs on the stretch that I've been showing you on from London to Henley, and you can see that a pretty steady rise in the numbers of pairs on that stretch during the succeeding time. That's just one little local area, of course, the Thames. We're talking about the whole of the UK. But this is the British Trust for Ornithology's Swan Index, which is based on very much larger numbers over a very large area. And it shows more or less the same thing, that shortly after, there was a small rise in numbers just before the lead ban, because there'd been a lot of publicity in trying to stop using lead, and a big increase thereafter. And again, leveling off now. They've hit some sort of other limit at the moment, but a pleasing rise of double or more of the population. This is not solely due to lead. I would argue it's fairly largely, but several other things were happening at the time. There was cleanup of the river was going on progressively, and still is. There was I lost it. There were several major rescue services, much more active there. Often they were responsible for rescuing and saving the lives of quite a few birds. That helped. And there were also some agricultural changes which changed the amount of agricultural chemicals going into the rivers, and those have probably benefited them as well. As so often happens, there's a mix of things, and we don't really know. Well, you can't separate them between them. So another thing that might have been involved there is the winter weather. The cygnets particularly are very susceptible to hard periods of winter weather. They don't do very well in competition with the older birds when in areas of the river where the birds are being fed. And as you can see, grazing is pretty difficult. under these conditions. So we've had a run of pretty mild winters overall for quite a long time, and that has also will have benefited the population. So I'm going to end with a short look at the future. There are a lot of hazards for these birds. They're flying into overhead wires, they're flying into bridges. They don't have very good eyesight ahead, and they have a very slow rate of rise if they try and get up and over something. And very often they just don't have time to do it in the interval between seeing an object and trying to avoid it. Accidents from fishing tackle are still fairly widespread. This is as you'll see, an X-ray of a rather objectionable triple hook that a swan has swallowed. Those can only be removed from operation, but the rescue services are pretty good at doing those, and they're going to probably live okay. But there's still a large amount of shooting. Shooting along the Thames is illegal. So that's another fishing tackle wound up with a whole lot of tackle. Those of you who know anything about guns will recognize these two things as air gun pellets. Air guns, unfortunately, are still legal for quite a number of young people to go, and the target is swan is a nice target. So we have quite a lot of trouble with those, and there seems to be more trouble with lockdown, more people with less to do or less option for going anywhere else. Quite a number of casualties from that. And dogs too are a big problem, especially when the broods are there. Again, in Scotland, it's illegal to have a dog under control that attacks livestock. I'm quite sure of the twist there, but in Britain, swans don't count as livestock. In Scotland, they can. There's also been an increase in boating, a popular pastime on the river. Main problem with that is that the passage of motorboats up and down the river churns up the water, makes it more turbulent, means that the plants on the bottom don't grow so well. They don't get enough light. If they're not physically churned up, they're blacked out, so growth is poor. And that may be very important. On one earlier year, we had a big drought just before swan upping, and the river was very low, and the boats were not allowed to go most areas. The plants grew luxuriantly, and the cygnets were heavier than most of the years around that time. So it does look as if there may be another important factor there. One of the most important things is the growing spread of suburbia, with more and more of the banks being concreted, necessary to stop erosion, useful for mooring boats. But when the birds have got very small cygnets, they need to be able to get out to their nest site, in and out every day, to roost there overnight. And where there's concreted steep banks, nesting is simply impossible. So more and more difficult in many places for them. But this is a bird that has managed here under, I think one might say, duress for a very long period of time. And I'm optimistic for a number of reasons that it's going to go on in the future. So I'm going to end there, and I'm happy to take any questions there may be.
Thank you, Professor Perrins, for your interesting talk in which you covered things like history of swan ownership and threats to the swan population. So yes, I'm going to collect questions from YouTube and also on Zoom. So if you're on Zoom, feel free to ask a question in person, or you could post your question on the chat or send it to me privately. Right, so I have one question here. What would you say is the dominant threat to the mute swan at the moment?
I don't think there is a dominant threat. I mentioned a whole slew of things that are not good news for swans. But when lead poisoning was prevalent, then deaths from lead poisoning were clearly the majority, were more important than any other single cause of death. In fact, they were more important than all other causes of death. That's not true any longer. There's lots of things that swans die from, but not a single pivotal cause, I think.
Thank you. So one question from YouTube. Have any diseases been observed to threaten the swan population?
Yes, two that we have fairly regularly. One is botulism, which is a bacterial infection, not of the birds, but of the water around the birds, which makes a very toxic position very often, and also they swallow some of them with the vegetation. That is usually a late summer disease when the water is low and the temperatures are high. It grows very well in shallow, non-flowing waters where swans like to go and eat or live. And that's periodic and it's local. The other is avian flu, which we don't know a great deal about how well it spreads. We have had a study of them at Abbotsbury a bit, and we know a little bit more there. It's a flu, and it's interesting in two ways to me, at any rate, and I'm not a virologist. It's seasonal again. It occurs mainly in sort of late December into early January, as does, of course, the human flus that we have are winter, are most common in winter. The other is that it kills a much higher proportion of the first year birds, the cygnets, than it does of the adults. And part of the reason, I hope I won't be told off by the virologists, but part of the reason seems to be that there are a lot of these close relatives to avian flu mulling around over there, and most of the birds have met one or two of them over time, and they're presumably not lethal ones. But by having them and they've built up immunities, they get some resistance to avian flu itself when the flu virus arrives. So I suppose that's a little bit true of what happens. The reason we have a flu jab is that we take in 2 or 3 mild flus to build up resistances to them, and they don't kill us. That's why, so we can have the jab safely. But then when you come up with a worse one, you get partial resistance through that one, and it helps you to get through it. I think it may be similar.
Thank you. And so one question here. Would you mind sharing a few memorable moments or your main responsibilities when you were the Her Majesty's Swan Warden?
Sorry, can you say that one again?
Would you mind sharing a few memorable moments or your main responsibilities as Her Majesty's Swan Warden?
Quite a few are falling in the river. I go up with the swan uppers every year, so I see quite a lot of what they get up to. I don't think I have any terribly memorable moments. And
thank you. One more question. How did you start your career in ornithology?
Okay, I can sort of say that. I've always been interested in natural history since I was very young indeed. I grew up through my tens and teens thinking I was going to be an entomologist, and I still rather fond of entomology. And I went to Queen Mary College London because it had a special entomology course. But while I was there, I got somewhat hooked on the sorts of studies you can do with animals that you can mark and see followed through successive generations. And insects are weak on that because, of course, they only last a year, most of them. But birds are much more amenable to those sorts of studies. And at that point, I switched. But entomology is a great subject.
Thank you. Thank you for answering those questions. I think if there's no other questions, I will pass the floor to Christoph, who will wrap up for this session.
So I'd just like to thank Professor Perrins again for joining us for the Varsity Sci Symposium and for taking us through the history, the present and the future of this fascinating bird, the Mute Swan, a bird that, at least if you live in the Oxford area or you live in Cambridge especially, that has accompanied us through our university careers that you might see whilst out on the river, but we might not know too much about. So thank you very much for introducing us to the history of the Mute Swan in Britain. And thank you everyone who joined us today. And we hope to see you soon for further sessions of Varsity Sci.
Okay, my pleasure.
Okay, we've just finished the live stream.